let me start by introducing the Anticancer Fund. I know that we're not exactly a household name in the UK. It was founded in 2009 in Belgium by a Belgian entrepreneur who had a family incidence of cancer. He had a scientific training, though he wasn't in biology or medicine himself, but what he saw of his sister's cancer treatment made him realise that there was a lot more that could be done for patients. So from the beginning, the Anticancer Fund is very much focused on what we can do for patients. It's a private foundation, completely not-for-profit, and one of the key things that we aim to do is support the development of new therapies for patients which have got little or no commercial value. So the repurposing is one example, but it's not the only example of the kind of things that we're interested in. Additionally, our patient focus means that we provide science-based information to patients. And that means not just putting credible information on a website, but it means actually talking to patients on a one-to-one basis about where they are in their cancer journey and what they can do. Although the Anticancer Fund is based in Brussels, I'm based in London, and the projects we support in the clinic and the clinical trials that we support don't have a geographic basis. So we have trials in the UK, France, Germany, the Netherlands, throughout Europe, and hopefully beyond soon. In terms of those areas of focus, in terms of clinical trials, it's not just repurposing. There are things like lifestyle interventions. So nobody is going to fund a trial that looks at a change in diet and exercise, but we're funding one in Manchester in the UK. There are types of immunotherapies that don't involve checkpoint inhibitors or very expensive targeted drugs. So one example is tumour-infiltrating lymphocytes, where the treatment is geared to that patient's tumour and their immune system. It's very difficult for academics to find funding for those kinds of trials from industry, and that's where we can step in. And then in terms of repurposing, we established a project called the Repurposing Drugs in Oncology Project, REDO, and I'll talk about that mainly in a minute. And then in terms of our public engagement, as I said, we publish scientifically credible information on our website and talk to patients, but we also talk to patients about fake cancer cures and the kinds of horrendous misinformation that's out there on the internet, very often very sophisticated scams that try to steal from very desperate people. And lastly, we're increasingly engaged in policy and regulation and engaging in the political process, because one of the things that we've learned in the last few years is the science isn't enough. When we started, we were perhaps naive, thinking that once we solve the scientific problems, everything else will follow. That's sadly not the case. And in terms of focus and the rare cancer connection, obviously there are so many different kinds of cancers, so we try and focus our limited funds on those areas in oncology that have got the highest unmet needs, and I'll come on to that in a sec. So the REDO project, it was founded by the Anticancer Fund and a very like-minded organisation in the US called Global Cures. The people who work on the project are based in Belgium, the UK and in the US. And we have a very specific remit when we're talking about repurposing. It's become quite a trendy term in the last few years, and there are different definitions. We're not talking about shelved compounds or taking an existing cancer drug and taking it from cancer A to cancer B. We're looking at non-cancer drugs and looking to see if we can use those as part of cancer treatments. And the way we're doing that is we're identifying drugs, existing drugs, mainly generics, that we think have got the highest potential to go to clinic. We summarise all of that information, so we do a lot of literature reviews, lots of summaries of the data, and we publish that in peer-reviewed journals. And then we're increasingly looking at what do we need to do to take this to trial, so we work with clinicians all over the world, and also what do we need to do in terms of the regulators to take these results, once we get the results, to clinic. So to recap why repurposing, a disadvantage of coming last on the day is that pretty much everybody has gone over this, but think of this as revision. Repurposing is faster and cheaper, so it speeds up the development process. But from a patient perspective, repurposing offers something else. The drugs are mainly oral drugs. They're convenient. They're safer. In contrast to de novo drug development, we already know the likely side effects. These drugs were designed to be taken for chronic conditions very often. So from a patient perspective, these are very user-friendly drugs. And of course, that user-friendliness feeds into speeding up that development cycle. Now, repurposing is not a new idea. Medicine is full of them, and actually probably the one example that everybody knows about is Viagra, which started off as a treatment for angina and is now a lifestyle drug for some people. But there are so many other examples. Methotrexate was one of the first oncology drugs, going back to the late 50s. It's now being used in rheumatoid arthritis. Oral cyclophosphamide, the same, another cancer drug. That's gone from oncology to inflammatory diseases. Unfortunately, looking in the other direction, looking for non-oncology drugs that have gone to oncology, there aren't that many. Thalidomide is probably the most well-known example. It's a notorious drug for what it did in terms of defects, but that was repurposed once to treat leprosy. It's now been repurposed again to treat multiple myeloma. All transretinoic acid, vitamin A, has gone from an acne treatment to being used in leukemia. Zoledronic acid, which is an osteoporosis drug, now being used to treat bone metastases. Once you've listed those three drugs, there's not very much else. In fact, there's one or two maybe examples, but that's it. Whereas if you look at other areas of medicine, there are huge numbers. So this is something that really is an area that's waiting to be exploited, but also it raises questions of why hasn't more been done in this direction. So in terms of the work we've done in REDO, this is the first 7 drugs that we've published the review papers on. And as you can see, we've got a range of things from antiparasitic worming treatments to an antacid, angina drugs. There's a really wide range of drug families that we've drawn from. And they've all got different mechanisms of action. And as part of what we're doing at REDO is we're not just saying this might be useful in cancer generically, we're saying this might be useful in this setting. So very, very specific. This is the cancer that these drugs might be useful in. And just to say that currently we've got around 200 drugs that we've identified that have got some evidence that they've got anti-cancer effects. So there's no shortage of candidates to explain why we've only had 3 going into the clinic. Now, I talked about high unmet needs. What that means in practice is rare cancers, and I'm going to be talking about a very specific rare cancer in a minute. Pediatric cancers is another area where there's high unmet needs. And even for the most common cancers, metastatic disease and disease that is resistant to first-line and second-line treatments, incredibly high unmet needs. So there's it's not that there's a shortage of areas for us to focus on. So some quick examples of the kinds of interventions we're looking at. Flivibrex is a trial being run in France, which is looking at a statin and an anti-inflammatory called Coxib for children with optic nerve gliomas, a very rare type of glioma, but no good current treatment. Another more common cancer is osteosarcoma, but once osteosarcoma is recurrent and metastatic, the outcomes are truly dismal. There we're looking at some standard drugs there, 4-drug combination to see what we can do. I talked about immunotherapies. We're looking at IL-2 and tumor-infiltrating lymphocytes in ovarian cancer. A trial in Germany looking at a diabetic drug, pioglitazone, and clarithromycin, an antibiotic, in resistant non-small cell lung cancer. And then our most ambitious trial in terms of drug combinations, the CUSP-9 trial. This is for recurrent glioblastoma, which is almost universally leads to death. And we're taking 9 different drugs in combination with chemotherapy. And amazingly, we've got that through regulators, and first patients are being treated now. And that's a very ambitious thing to do, to try and take so many drugs, but it's a disease that really does need some radical thinking if we're going to tackle it. So let me talk about this rare cancer, angiosarcoma. It's a soft tissue sarcoma. Now, soft tissue sarcomas are about 6% of all cancers, and angiosarcoma is probably 2 or 3% of those. So it's a very, very rare disease, and it's a rare disease that's treated with standard chemotherapy drugs that you would give to any soft tissue sarcoma. The outcomes are not very good. About 25% of patients respond to treatment. Median overall survival is under 10 months. And even with the latest drugs, pazopanib as an example there's not much in the way of improvement. That curve is pretty much the same as the curve for the existing treatments. When the disease has spread and when it's metastatic, then there really are very few options open. And the drug we're looking at to treat this rare cancer is propranolol. Propranolol is a standard antihypertensive beta blocker used by millions of patients every day. It's actually a drug that has actually an incredibly wide variety of medical conditions that it treats, from anxiety to hypertension to migraine. It's got quite a wide range. But till now, nothing in oncology. We did a review, and we found a huge amount of data for this drug. There's data that shows, for example, that women with breast cancer who have hypertension and are treated with propranolol have superior outcomes to women who aren't treated with propranolol. There's lab work, there's animal work, an incredibly wide range of data, and in a number of different diseases: breast cancer, colorectal, glioblastomas. So, a drug that has potential in many, many different types of cancer. So, where do we start from propranolol to angiosarcoma? And there we have to look at a thing called infantile hemangioma. Now, this poor baby has got a widespread infantile hemangioma. Now, this is a benign tumour, but the benign doesn't really cover it, because you can see it's not just facially disfiguring. It can cause huge amounts of problems. And in the case of one child, it was causing problems with obstruction, and they decided to treat the obstruction with propranolol. So they're not using it to treat infantile hemangioma, they're treating the symptoms. And as you can see, it starts to disappear just after the addition of the propranolol. The clinicians in France were astounded, and they did two very important things. One, they repeated the treatment on other patients, and in fact this little chap here is the second patient they treated. And they published. And once they published, that brought it to the attention of a huge number of other people who confirmed with individual patients and trials, which recently led to a very large international phase 3 trial which confirmed propranolol is effective. A pharma company very sensibly realised that actually there was something that could be done here. They reformulated propranolol so that it was easy to give to babies. So there was a good reason for doing that, but of course it also meant that they then had IP protection and could get a return on investment for the cost of those trials. The regulators very quickly stepped in, and what we have at the end of that is a very successful example of drug repurposing. They've taken the drug from one disease to another disease and gone through and had the treatment license, and it's now the new standard. So where does that fit in with angiosarcoma? Well, obviously people wanted to know, we know it works with infantile hemangioma, why? And so they started looking at the beta-adrenergic receptor, which is what the beta blocker acts on, in different types of tumours, benign tumours and malignant tumours. And sure enough, you probably can't see it down there, but there at the top, infantile hemangioma is a great target. But then there are these other malignant tumours that also look pretty good. In the US, they then take that on and try it in an animal model, and they show that in a mouse model of angiosarcoma, propranolol reduces the tumour. Very quick study, great animal model. People take look at that data and the infantile hemangioma, and we have some case reports. And really, when we're dealing with rare cancers and rare diseases in general, people should never underestimate the value of individual case reports and case series reports. They are hypothesis forming. When you have very few patients with a disease in the world, every new data point is important. But there was a case of a 69-year-old woman with relapsing metastatic angiosarcoma, a disease which would have a truly horrendous outcome and a survival that would be measured in just a couple of months. She lasted for 20 months, and while she was on the propranolol and metronomic chemotherapy, the disease was diminished. It's only when she stopped the treatment that there was a relapse, and then for various reasons she didn't go back on. That case report was followed up by a second case report in the US, and again, this is important. We've got a case report in India and a case report in the US. One of the things that we're always looking for is institutional bias or people who are, convinced that what they're doing is the right thing. So you look for the fact that independent groups are producing these same results. It adds that extra level of confidence. And again, in this case, they would have expected a 2-year survival rate of 0 for someone in this poor chap's position, but you can see that the tumour started to shrink and has had a good response. People have followed up, and we now have 7 additional patients with a 100% response rate. Now remember, in that, when we looked at the response to standard chemo, we were talking about a 25% response rate. In clinical trials for angiosarcoma, 25 to 40% is average. In this case, it's only 10 patients, so it's a small number. But some of these trials are quite small numbers as well. 100% response rate. They're not cured, but in 100% of cases their disease is stabilised or they've had some partial or complete regressions. So that's quite impressive data. It's also had additional animal model work, so we're trying to kind of establish the mechanisms of action, and more importantly, to look at propranolol in all of these cases isn't a monotherapy, it's added to other treatments. So we need to identify which are the other treatments that this is going to work with. And then a case report at the end of last year, again, what was interesting in this one was that this is a case report that looked at the same kind of treatment that we want to do in a clinical trial. So where do we go from here? And I've been told I've only got 5 minutes. So there's a clinical trial in France. We have taken, as a not-for-profit organisation, we've gone to the EMA and we've gained orphan drug designation. There are different clinical groups in the world working on Angiosarcoma, interested in propranolol, so we've created a task force. So we want to avoid duplication. Remember, in these kind of rare cancers, every patient counts. So we don't want them doing things in parallel and not getting the most out of the information. We had a scientific advice meeting with the MHRA, which was incredibly useful, and I think this is a trick that a lot of people in the non-pharma world miss, and I can't emphasize enough that one of the key things that we got from this was, if you're thinking about doing clinical trials, talk to the regulators, because you may think you're doing something that's going to get you to registration, but actually you're doing something that's going to cost you time, and actually you could save time and do something different. After angiosarcoma, though, we think propranolol can be used for other cancers. It's also, we think it can be used at the time of cancer surgery. Nearly every cancer patient is treated with tumour resection. Propranolol and a COX-2 inhibitor at the time of resection has been shown in animal models and in some retrospective data to reduce recurrence rates. Cancer patients die of metastatic disease. If we can make sure that their first treatment, their first surgery to remove the tumour is really definitive and they don't get the metastases, then we've saved lives. But they're not, propranolol is not the only drug that we're interested in. There's, as I said, we've got a huge number, and we've got about a dozen trials now ongoing. So in terms of obstacles, finding interested clinicians has been challenging at times. There's competition for patients, institutions. If they've only got a certain number of patients, then the pharma trial can often get those patients because of financing. Licensing isn't something that we're good at. And this is one of the things that we realised looking in our drugs, when we go back and we look at the data for cimetidine and some of these other drugs, we look at it and we think, wow, these are fantastic results. Why didn't this go anywhere? And the reason they don't go anywhere is the clinicians running the trials, they're expert in running trials and treating patients. They get a good result, they publish a paper, but there's no momentum, there's nobody there to take it to the next stage to get the drug license. So increasingly, that's what we're focused on. How do we get through the obstacles so that the positive results we hope to get actually lead to the clinic? Role of patients. The first thing, lots of people get excited about repurposing because it's cheap and then it's going to be faster for it. The key point is we've got to prove efficacy first. Efficacy is everything. No one wants a cheap treatment if that cheap treatment isn't as good as an expensive treatment. So, a key thing is we're really, really keen on repurposing, but we should keep in mind that what we want is to make sure that we prove that these drugs definitively work. There That said, patient organisations have influence. You can talk to the politicians, you can talk to the regulators, you can make sure that the playing field is levelled a bit more so to make up for some of the financial disincentives that we have to face. For rare disease populations, you're never going to get enough patients to fund new molecules. The best you can hope for is that there's a new molecule and in 15 years' time it will make its way down to you. So repurposed drugs actually are a reservoir that we should be looking to exploit more. And really, again, focusing on when you're talking about planning a trial, when you're talking about taking a repurposed drug, really you need to keep in mind where you want to be, and where you want to be is treating patients in the clinic. And that means not off-label. Some people would be happy with off-label, but off-label is suboptimal. Off-label means that doctors will be reluctant to prescribe, there's problems about paying sometimes. So really what we want is these drugs to be used on label, and that's a really important point. So that's it. Patients can apply political pressure, so get out and hassle. Thank you.